Well, it kind of makes sense. Should go back to the first. Hey, what's up? Hello. How's it going? So far, it's not looking too good for a bull case. But it's not done yet. So the problem here is the so what happened was there's a jump here on the creek where you had the leap over. This would be your standard cross up, but the cross up didn't yield a higher high, and it actually pushes like slightly above the opposing creek coming down, which are these 2 points, which is again after you had a weakness over here, it came back up. So these are essentially just UT type motions, like up thrust type motions, all distributive action. And very, very, very evidently does come above that top on Friday, which I was concerned about because it pushed up. I was kind of happy it ended above 3, but I think that's kind of a misleading, it was a misleading, maybe sort of, if you thought, oh, it's above 350, it's going to be bullish because of options or something. I think it kind of misleads that in that way. And when I'm looking at this on the big picture, I'm like, okay, if you look at this as all part of a bottom, there's a solid M on the bottom, there's a solid M on the left, and there's already one on the right. So this is the concern, right, is that you haven't yet made that jump in a strong way. So what's missing here is missing the SOS. So I think if this were to go up above the top, which is very evidently like right here at this peak, there's a double top right there actually. I think it's 362. Yeah, very evidently 362. If it doesn't come back up there and really push it, I think you're in trouble. And frankly, even now I'm like, meh, I'm not sure. So this is an early resistance push on Friday. Backs up, finds some support. I don't like the idea of saying like, oh, it's running out of room. There was a triple bottom here. You know, timing is kind of exactly what you would think here in this case. It's basically like evenly spread in this wave structure. But anytime you look at this kind of stuff, and anytime I look at it, I'm thinking about how at the end of the day, like, I just want to see it finish the wave on the right side in a strong way if it's going to be bullish, not in a weak way, because that's kind of self-evident, basically is what I'm trying to say. Like, anybody can do that. You can look at that and say, did it make a higher high? No. So as of right now, it hasn't changed direction. It's still pointing down, which typically when this happens and it's continuing down like that, this is unusual because it made that triple bottom. I'll give you that. But typically when that happens, you're setting up for like an S curve, because if that second M here doesn't push higher, you're going to get only one of two things. You're either going to make a spring, which again would be kind of unusual, but given that we had a triple bottom, you could estimate, well, maybe we're going to try to spring down beneath that floor at 333. And if we do that, maybe we're just going to try to go for that gap at 323. But then you have to, of course, come back above. It's not like as simple as, oh, it just goes down there. And then, you have to re-break. So the confirmation is delayed. The price action confirmation is what I'm trying to say. Confirmation of upside. But honestly, if this is the case, then I'm like doubly concerned because now you've got an ice here. You see how this kind of compounds on itself as you move along? This is the same thing every time. So if this rises and it fails to make a higher high, which thus far it has failed to make a higher high. This could change, but thus far it has failed. If it fails to make a higher high, now you have to not only come back above this floor, the 333 after a spring, but you also have to come all the way back up over the ice, which typically if it's going to do that, it's usually like that's the triangulation. So that would put this out on like Tuesday if it was going to happen. That's the only way I can see this kind of moving forward. Now this is very opposite land when you think about what it is we were looking for, which was really a good buy-in here and then elevated price action during the week. This to me is already showing some chinks in the armor to some degree. But I'll give you this, a shallow S-curve here. Based on what I'm seeing, like right now, the shallow S-curve and the S-curve would be the only two options because, again, it failed to make that higher push. If it changes today and this pushes up above 362, then I'll change my tune on it. But right now, it's probably going to have to make that drop. That's my assumption going out here because it did not make that advancement. And frankly, it doesn't look particularly great, like a great case for it. Well, we've got time. Yeah, we do. Obviously, there's a little bit of time left here. Maybe, I don't know, maybe an hour or something like that right here before this kind of terminates. That's sort of the end of that pattern. And then I'd be waiting and seeing what happens next. So this is certainly a possibility if we want to have a spring. I don't think it's done anything horribly detrimental aside from that one little push-up right here. I think you could potentially have a spring and still go, but then you can't confirm it until way up top. If it does this, that's probably the end of the pattern. I wouldn't expect it to continue like sideways over here very much unless there's like a backup, but we don't know yet. The backup wouldn't go that low. It'd only come back down to like maybe 350. So that's like the only other spot that you could place it. So if this drops low, hits 324 and then heads up and SOS is above 364, then we may have a backup on our hands. We may not. It's one of the, obviously you can't really tell until you're there. And it doesn't really make a difference as long as it stays strong. It doesn't go more than 50% beneath maybe this particular push or specifically probably between these two markers. So that would place it like way over here at 350. And that kind of makes sense. 350 is an important ledge. So I'd be looking at this like, all right, we've got a little window for something to change. If it doesn't change, probably going to see a dip. And that's bullish case. So bullish case, it pushes up. Then you have a backup potential. It doesn't have to back up, but you have a backup potential here. And then after that, yeah, you basically just go. And we had looked at a few charts last week. We had some pretty good timing, I think pinpointed to about the 10th, which on the chart over here is like this green area. Certainly, depending on how this builds out, really wouldn't affect that very much. This could easily, again, be like kind of a higher SOS type mark of sorts and still be fine. You know what I mean? Going into like the 10th. So I don't really care if it chops to the top or not. I'm not really considering that. I'm just saying like that's roughly where the timing kind of terminates. If you look at the pivots, once it makes the top here and goes, it goes. So that's kind of best case scenario. If it's going to make another advancement, I think that at this point, that's basically all we have in terms of like best case scenario, because I'm not seeing any kind of I'm not really seeing another path forward at this point. Again, unless something changes today and it pushes above that 362, I think this is pretty inevitable. So the other option was a full S curve. Full S curve is quite large here. It goes very far. So basically what you're looking at is you're looking at a 50-50 around 347, roughly, you know, and you could just say around 350 if you want. But essentially like that first ledge when it came down, that's like 349. And then there's a second ledge here at like 346. Those two would be the essentially like the middle. You can see we're consolidating around them right now. And then when you drop, you'd come all the way down. And this seemed right to me because of varying other things that were going on. We saw a lot. And it may at first look really different than this, but it's only different because it breaks down out of this red pocket. So you can see how like one example is like a shallow S-curve that bounces right off that red trend, which is kind of a larger ice level, if you will. And the other is a drop through it. If it drops through it, same thing. You've got this issue of like, you could easily still have a pop here, maybe in response to GME earnings or building up into it, but then you have this really unadvantageous positioning where you could get stuck under 350. In order to reverse from this point of view, it would be very challenging. You would have to affirm this bottom line, which I don't know, man. At this stage, it's really hard for me to tell where the middle is because S-curves are weird. Like they may build out sideways here in a very uniform way, which is what it's doing, like a 1, 2, 3. As it stands, you would say, well, the middle is then somewhere like in the middle, like literally. And then you would put it on that, maybe on that creek jump. And it looks about right to be into Thursday. You could be all the way down here at like 296. Basically go back to test 3. That's very fast. So the question mark of like what happens after is a big question mark because I don't know. It's a long time between that, which is again Thursday the 5th and Tuesday the 10th. You got basically you got a work into Friday, so it could be a max pain type deal. And then you've got a potential pop Monday, you know, and then Tuesday is like either a turnaround or continuation of whatever trend. So these aren't particularly different. There's like slight differences. I was using different markers on these two charts, but so if I had to make a guess, I was thinking last week, I was thinking that this week would be more or less flat. I don't know for a fact it's going to be flat. You know, we could see this go all the way down to 295 and then pop back up to near 327. And that's not terribly off from where we opened the week up here near 350. So 25 cents is a little bit down on the week. I'm thinking about that candle, what that would look like. And I don't think it would look that bad. It could be like a bit of a hammer, a red hammer candle if it did something like that on the weekly. And that might, again, signal some kind of possible continuation the next week. But the other potential here was really more sideways, just really chopping into Friday this direction. And that's sort of what I had thought if we came up Monday, which is today, or Tuesday, that we might see some more sideways. It may take longer. And again, it's still very possible to have like a longer SOS and then break down in a backup real quick for perhaps on Friday. What's the takeaway? Well, the takeaway at this point is really just, like as I said, there's kind of an unfortunate reality right now, which is that this is very likely not going forward because of this rejection. So in order for us to see it, and it's going to sound kind of silly, but in order for us to see it kind of end green this week, in my opinion, you have to see that push over. And it's not because like that just kind of check boxes you're green. It's really more about the signaling of a bullish price action. And we just don't have that signal. It's not here. All we have is a little tiny wick up with a sell-off. And thus far, it looks like it's building out again into a potential drop here. I think it could be a shallow S-curve. So that's why I'm saying hey, this isn't necessarily going to drop all the way to 290 something, but we'll see. And that, like I said, this is a problematic zone because it's very difficult to quantify it. If you wanted to trade it like ahead of time, I mean, like to really say like this is definitely going to happen, it's difficult. And to see where exactly those numbers are going to be is kind of difficult. You can tell where the setup wants it, but the way you could trade this is if it drops down to 322, no matter what happens, you probably can trade from that gap fill. I've said that before, and things don't always work that way, right? I mean, you could have like a really weak bounce here, and then it could just die. But if you don't mind the risk, it's very likely that wherever this breaks down, specifically coming into about an hour from now, it's probably going to come back up to that point regardless. At the very least, it's going to hit 333. That's not a very good trade from 322. And of course, you could trade down if you so choose, but I'm not finding that put positions are moving very much right now. So there's a little bit of a risk there. They're not really budging at all on the downside. I had bought some put positions up here, and they're just red. Part of that's just volatility getting kind of crushed, and after the big move, it happens, And I did buy more, actually bought more positions down here, but when it first started, way back, when it was real cheap, for longer out, in case it came back down, like that was the expectation it might do that. So yeah, so we've got a lot of trajectories going into Friday and Monday. We don't really have anything right this second that makes me think it's just going to go to the moon all of a sudden. If it were to break out here in advance, again, above that 360, I'm repeating myself a lot, but it really is imperative. If it goes above that 362 mark early in the week, I think that's what I'm saying. That's a chance that you actually have like a bullish action this week. But if we don't see that today or maybe tomorrow, I don't think it's going to happen this week. So I just don't. And we've had some weird weeks where we've had nothing, and then a really green Friday or a green Friday into Monday or something like that. So, but yeah, anywho, this isn't a bad trend though. I kind of like this trend. So one of the good news is here is I just marked this off, and this goes back to the first support that was made and really the first trend that was built here. And we've definitely done a good job of kind of returning back to it frequently. And you can see building off of it. It almost looks like a head and shoulder motion building off of it. If it does do the dip here, you can see that shouldering on an angle. That's actually a good thing, because if it's adhering to this as a resistance, then there's a chance that after a dip, you're going to come back to it and return back to it. And that's exactly what this looks like. And then you can see like the final move here would be set up if that were to happen to kind of push right off of that. So I think everything's in a really good spot. It's just a question of like, will it or won't it, right? Take that path. And I'm uncertain. Last week we did a lot of work on this setup, and as best we could tell, again, maybe June 10th based on the setup, and that's very, very, very close to where GME's earnings is. So I think you're going to get a pop, but we'll see. If we're setting up really low, it could just be a pop to distribute. And I've changed my tune quite a bit about it because of what we talked about last week. I had low numbers on Friday. I'm not going to go through it all over again, but last week we talked about this, and I said that really you have to kind of change your perspective a little bit because of the way that this positioned itself around the previous cross down. So the first iteration didn't do that, but the second iteration did. And then the first iteration did not exceed the lower trajectory, but the second iteration went to the higher trajectory on the pump up. So there's a lot of like second, like, oh, it didn't take the first option, it took the second option, which is a higher option. So that could be by design a way of building out to a final push. And we talked about that last week, and I talked about the on balance and what that would look like if it did that. So there's probably more going on here with EMAs and junk, but I'm not going to look at everything. And I think GME is much the same. This is an earnings week, so to speak. So TradingView still has it on here as Wednesday the 4th, but I don't think that's correct. And then I found somebody had put a press release out that said they were going to have an investors meeting on the 12th. But then I separately saw another date that said they were releasing their numbers on the 9th. So what does that mean? I don't know. You know, it's kind of confusing to me when you get three very different numbers. And some people are going to say, well, it's this. This is it. I'm like, okay, well, I trust no one right now when it comes to these numbers because I've had three different ones, and I think it's silly. So especially when it's on like official press releases or whatever from different places. So I'm thinking it's the middle. I'm just going to go middle of the road and say it's the 9th, which, you know, makes sense to me. It's like a Monday. If it's sooner, it's sooner. But from now till then, kind of on earnings watch. Typically, GME tends to run up into earnings. That's not always the case, as you can tell. Like previously, we've had some pretty different approaches, but most of these, even looking backwards, they still were up into earnings. Even if they dropped like right after, this was up. This was up. This one went up and then dropped after. This one was up and it did go a little further and then dropped after. This one was dropping and then just suddenly ran way back up, like the day of earnings. So, I mean, you have fairly consistent, 5 out of 5, the last earnings have been up into earnings. So the only one that's kind of different, again, if they're going down, maybe there's a little bit of difference in terms of how that happens. But the only one that's kind of different in terms of like direction right after is this one, which continued. This was in December of 2024. It continued after. It still went to the upside. I'm thinking that based on where it is, it's in a pretty good spot to have kind of a resting period. But it wouldn't surprise me. Like this is the perfect spot to kind of chill out if you just want a sideways week. But it also wouldn't surprise me to see a little bit of an early advancement, again, with the anticipation that if it's a Monday earnings, again, you could have this kind of a drop here and still get some momentum going before Monday and really like pop. And then maybe Tuesday is a turnaround day, or it's already there. I had done a few different measurements on GME. All of my measurements with S-curves are always like somewhat speculative because, and as they should be, because there's always a question of like, well, you can use them, but you have to have like a middle marker. So the only way to properly draw an S-curve is to have like a really strong center mark. And that way you can make the S-curve proportionally like the same. But as you'll see with a lot of my charts, like they're not perfect. And then that creates these issues of like, well, why not? I don't know. I just kind of like am using what I try to do with the middle. I don't know why they're not always perfect. But what I try to do with the middle is that I try to use the breakout point, right? Or the pivot point on the wave. So you can see here, like there's a breakout that occurred, and it occurred here in October on the 30th. And then you have to kind of think about, well, where's the top of the previous wave? The reason that works is because it should be the point in which it changed direction, should be like kind of the penultimate of that wave. So it should give you that sense of like, okay, partially we're there on a sine wave. But we're also talking about an S-curve that goes to the upside that could be building out, frankly, from that point. And I had done that previously, like from this bottom up here. I did it on this chart, like from October 24th up. And it didn't give me the right date. I mean, it said upside for sure was going to be hitting 32. And I got that. And maybe even 35. I got that. But it had said, when I did the measurement, it said like, I think it was like Wednesday, it was like the week of the 12th, but it was like Monday or Tuesday or something. So it was like a whole week off. Why? I don't know, because the measurement made sense to me at the time that was correct. But looking back on it, all I can really say is maybe it had something to do with, I don't know, like when the earnings was announced and then there's like a delay action or something. I really couldn't tell you. Because like I would have put it, looking back, I would have put it like on this breakout. Even this is like a day later. So again, it would have been backwards quite a few days. I mean, that's a significant 1 week difference. That's Wednesday the 21st versus Wednesday the 28th. And that's just a really small change. I don't know why. Like I'm trying to say, like I just don't know. I'm not really sure. So my estimations using S-curves are usually pretty close, but they're not perfect. So I try to urge viewers who are maybe watching, if you like that and you're going to use it as part of your own DD, your due diligence, just make sure you're careful, because that was the only creek apparent, but apparently this is the actual creek that was chosen. But like I don't know how that came about. You know, there's no, maybe in extended hours or something, but there's no other marker. It's just the top till you get here. That's it. So like, why would I have not used this? I don't know. You know what I mean? That's the answer. Like I just wouldn't have. I would have used it. So there's a weird kind of a question mark there where I'm like, maybe there's a way to, in this motion, to like delay that advancement, and then that causes like a new trend to appear. Maybe it has more to do with something that I'm not using, like a Fibonacci fan marker. Maybe it has to do with a larger movement that I'm not aware of. Or maybe it's just extended hours and there's some combination of the two. So I usually assume that I'm probably not like dead on. So this S-curve seems to go up into the 24th, but it would not surprise me if this hit really early. Some other news, GME's valuation has changed quite a bit, and I read an article talking about making a case for $40 for valuation for GME based on their recent investments and the payoffs, which is quite high. And I had previously gone on the record to say that I didn't think it was that high. I thought it was probably lower than where we are now, but I think that was a mistake, because the investments that they made, especially if they pay off with the Bitcoin investments and the cash raise and all that stuff, their current valuation looks really good. So there's definitely a bullish case to be had from a fundamental standpoint. We all know that doesn't necessarily mean that the company is going to be green all the time. It's not. All companies, even if they're bullish, have significant downturns at different times. But I do find that to be kind of curious. So I'm wondering if that's going to play a role in this current earnings based on everything that's happened in the last 6 months on GME with the Bitcoin purchase and all the other stuff they did with that offering that they made. Well, the purchase was a debt for equity kind of thing, I think. But I still don't think they're going to do the, I don't think it's going to end up having to get paid out. So anyways, that's neither here nor there yet. We'll see. That's down the road. That had a lot of time. That was what happened with this big like drop point right here. So anyways, so right now we've done like a wraparound. I think there's a pretty simple way to read this as and interpret this as like a type of wave, which is with a creek, this is the middle. So I did say that I'm not particularly concerned if it comes back down to near 26. That being said, that's a very deep dive. So if that does that, you can't do an S-curve from where it stands and hit that marker. It would have to go up more, I think. Not a ton more, but it'd have to go up at least to like 31. And then it'd have to take time. And the faster it wants to do it, then the higher this would need to go to sort of fill that out. But like anything, I do think this is a type of slingshot motion. If you go down that low and you come back up, you're likely going to get a pretty big propulsion. So we were looking at the doubling from the top values, and it does look like it might be hitting $48. So we'll see if it can get there. That goes back to like some of the earliest trajectory points that we had for GME, going way back to this build out on the bottom from November 2023. And these are significant points, you know. I've talked about this before, but when you have what appears to be like a cat ear, where you have like the ear one and then a paw and then a flatter ear two, pay attention to the points of contact, specifically the point on the very bottom, the final support, not necessarily the first support. Sometimes the first support is used. It's a discretionary thing. You just have to look at the chart on the whole. But usually it's like the support that held when it broke out. That's usually what I'm looking at, because that's the one that really where the buy-in is. And then the sell-off, where the sell-off is. Again, not necessarily the first place this starts selling off or the first time this sells, but really the final sell-off, where the volume really picks up. Those two spots almost always, if you do them, are going to be an ongoing anchor point for a move. And that's what we see here. In fact, there's a breakout and a return right back to it. And then ever since then, we're kind of wrapping around it. And we're running into a place where now we're kind of running the risk of like, if we go up there again, we could run the risk of distributing along it, because if we hit like $48 or something, you can see why like that could be a clean hit against it. And that doesn't mean it has to go down. I'm just saying like that's a typically when it does do that, like if you go back and look at a distribution and you've identified this marker, that's where you could have that rejection. You're calling GME 19 WTF. Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from. Maybe this chart over here. Do I think that that's possible? Yeah. You know, you should be really careful about what it is that you decide to pick out when you come onto people's channels and stuff, because there's more than one possibility here for sure on the screen. I didn't say it's definitely happening. You have to understand, like, there's two competing waves here, waveforms. And if this is a distributive waveform and it has already had a weakness, so it really can't come back down beneath this 24-25 area again. That's really what this is about. So you just want the bottom line, which I understand, but that's not really what I'm all about here. I'm about understanding why that would happen. And no, you just, again, you keep asking for something that you shouldn't be asking for from somebody. Well, okay. Oh, look, I can't comment on someone else's work. I don't know what they're doing. I've spent my time and due diligence here over hundreds and thousands of hours looking at stuff. And if I think after looking at it for hundreds and thousands of hours or whatever, that there's a couple different paths, that's because I don't feel super strongly. With AMC, I feel pretty strongly that it could have a serious downside to near 2, which sounds very similar to what this other person's saying. That was something that I talked about January 2024, coming down really low after pushing up to near 14. And that's not something that's really ever changed for me. There's always been that risk of, especially early on with AMC, it had that SO, the sign of weakness, when it sold off. You can't really ignore that. So just respectfully, yes, those are my ideas. They're not short-term ideas. They're not based on what anyone else says. I don't compare myself. I don't even watch other people. This is the sign of weakness right here. after the bounce. It came down lower after the initial sell-off. And then ever since then, I've been thinking it's probably going to come down to like near twos, maybe even 188, possibly even lower later, but I don't want to get in that. But this idea of like dropping down lows by August, I don't know, man. Does this person, I guess the question is, I guess, does this person, I would ask the question, does this person use like a consistent methodology that is consistently not necessarily right all the time, because that's a little bit unfair, but that isn't ever evolving. Like, it makes sense because it does work, and then when it doesn't work, it makes sense, still makes sense. Because the market is a flexible place. You don't have to have like certainty. And I also don't agree with the idea that it's necessarily predetermined. This to me seemed pretty obvious from a long time ago that this would pump up. I mean, if you go back to, I don't know, here, I guess, in March, I thought it would probably come down and then pop back up. And we've been talking about going to 4 forever. So we called out that move, and I think they had as well. But then the idea of it being like an up thrust coming back down. So I guess what I'm saying is like, make sure that whoever you follow is very consistent and diligent in their work, that they put the time into it. It's really easy to come on here on this platform and post a video. So, and it's also pretty easy to gain a following. And I mean that self-reflectively, because like I got a huge following really early on for almost no reason. Like I had mapped out what I thought was the fractal pattern, which really was a shrinking iterative pattern, which I now recognize. It was a real pattern. It was there, and it is still true what I had said about it. That was in like November of 2021, and I got like 7,000 followers like overnight almost. But was that warranted? I don't know. I don't think it was. I mean, just to be fair, like I don't think it was warranted. And I've spent the remainder of that time kind of maybe proving that out, that maybe it is warranted, you know, if we're going to go through with this. So just be mindful of who you listen to. I don't disagree with Nick on this particular issue, that this probably comes down to 2 by August. Makes sense. It may be sooner than that. But again, when I say stuff like I agree with or I disagree with, there's this kind of idea that like I'm somehow competing with them, and I don't feel that. So I'm trying to emphasize that. I'm not really, I know it sounds weird because I'm acting kind of weird about it, like guarded about it. I'm picking words very carefully because I don't copy anybody. And I've been accused of that at different times because someone will come in and say, well, this looks just like what so-and-so does. And I'm like, okay. And I've said before, Nick P told me, his words, not mine. He told me that he used my methodology when he made like 6 figures or something on it. And I don't know if that's true or if he was just trying to like blow smoke, you know, to try to make me like him at the time because he didn't have a following back then. Then he got really big, right? And I disappeared, and that's the way it is, and that's fine. But just be mindful of like where that information comes from, and just be careful. I don't know what he's since done. He might be very different than what I'm doing. And I've defended him before. I mean, when it was back here and he said he thought it was going to go 190, and I said, I don't think it goes to 190 right now, but he may not be wrong long term. And I had said that. Sometimes you get these targets. Now it might go to 190. You know, he had said a year plus ago that he thought it might go to a year and a few months ago, it might go to 190. And at the time I thought, no, it's probably going to hit 250s and then we're going to have a supports around mid threes. That's what happened. But there was reasons why I said that, and I saw what he was seeing, but I didn't agree with it. Nevertheless, sometimes you see targets and they're there, you think you're going to get there. This could still be one of those times, and we went through it last week. So don't ask about times like it's like you're going to go out and buy a bunch of stuff. You know, we really don't know what the future holds. And if certain things don't work out here, you could be coming back down to the ones like later, way later, in like 2029, depending on how this bottom fleshes out. So anything left on the table might seem like it's just left, like it's never going to be, we're never going to come back here, but that's not true. So it would not surprise me to see like a 226 hit or something like that and never get down to 180s or 190s. And we're all just kind of assuming that it's going to happen now, but it may not. It's better to just watch the chart when you get to that point. So you should have that idea. I think the same thing's true for GME here. So just coming back around to the question, you said, when is that supposed to happen? I don't know with GME. I had a lot of ideas about this as a distribution model because of the way it's setting up with the cat ears. But you have to understand that like the way I do things is really wave based. So what happened here is it jumped over the wave. So to say that it's definitely going to come down here would be very, very silly. That's really an assumption at this point that you think it, well, maybe it's an interpretation is the better way to put it. It's an interpretation of like what you think this was back in April. If you think this is a sign of weakness, which it looks like, at least on this trend, then the next time it breaks this trend, especially if it breaks this creek as well, it's bearish and it's going to go down below this $18 marker. It will. So when does that happen? Now? At $31? Or does that happen when it drops through here at 23.50? It happens at 23.50. Because the truth is that right now it has not made an advancement that is necessarily, like there's no sign of weakness until that point. So you have this, what I call a shrinking iterative model, right? And then it breaks out and it forms a larger, like a larger wedge, essentially. And so you have a wedge here that did break. You don't have any kind of break at all early on, as far as I can tell, of that trend. So there's no what we call a sign of weakness right there. So it breaks out and then it lays back up on top of this. This is the part that gets confusing because it has this massive like double move that could be read as like a double SOW. It could also be read as kind of a double spring because it dips twice beneath that floor. Doesn't break it, but it certainly looks like a weakness. But then a curious thing happens in that it jumps again over the creek. That's where we are right now. So to say like, oh, this is definitely going to go down, what you're basically saying is that this wave is not going to hold. Because right now it has made a jump over resistance. So that to me is a big deal. You shouldn't just ignore it. You can say, well, I think it's distributive, and it could be. It did pop above that 34 top. That's a bit of a problematic thing if you think this could be distribution, because if it pops over that top and it drops back through the creek, that's where you have problems, right? So we know this because we're paying attention and we're aware of the way that distribution works in the market, and we're also aware of the waveforms. But what? What else happens sometimes when you go over a top is that you get what's called a backup. And a backup could lead to, again, like a UTAD, like an upthrust after distribution. But backups are often confused. SOSs are often confused with stuff like upthrusts after distribution. They just are. So the sign of weakness is really only on the level of the ice. It's not on the greater picture. There's no drop through previous lows. This is like the only time you really get that. That's why when I looked back at this, I thought, well, that does signal that you might come down lower in the future, perhaps by August, right? That certainly seems possible, but you have to then have a breakdown. We don't have that because plenty of times this could be like an SOS and break out and it can still go because it's jumped the creek as long as it doesn't come back through that marker. So I'm really focusing right there on 25. So I'm not telling you guys that it's definitely going to go through 25 just yet. I'm looking at the current measurements. I'm looking at the retracement values. I can see that it would be easy enough to kind of keep this floated. Maybe that's a little bit too far right there. Should be sooner than later. It's also very possible that this stays floated until August 6th and doesn't go beneath it. There's a marker here that is really right on the intersection of August 5th, which is essentially exactly the same time that we think AMC earnings may happen, right in that pocket. And I've previously described how like the 2-year wave here is actually August to August, although it's late August. It's a little bit closer to September, but that August would be the ideal month to kind of run hard if you were going to wait and do like a 20-day run or something like that, which is more typical of AMC to run over the course of like 20 days, which maybe is only like 12 trading days or something. That's way more typical for AMC than to just run up in like one afternoon, right? So, yeah, does that work? Sure, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. So I don't have any problem telling you that that's what this probably is if it breaks down here, that this was a sign of weakness, and it will, if it breaks down, have a massive drop through here and probably head back down towards, 17 or so. And that's just a start. And assuming it doesn't just keep going, there's also a massive S-curve here. And when you go through distribution cycles, if this rejects, which again, I think it would need to come up higher again. I think it would need to probably make one more upthrust towards 45 regardless for a lot of reasons. I think it makes almost no sense to sort of stop here, but it'd have to do at least one more upthrust, in my opinion. I just think that's very unlikely to just sort of not go up again, but that's because of the bigger picture. Like if this were to distribute, you'd want to see like that. This build out on the cat ear produces like another top that goes above this guy at 46. Just depends on liquidity. I don't have the answer to that. If they don't need it, they don't need it. But that to me would make more sense if you're going to sell down hard. If you're only going to go down a little bit, you probably could make do with a 35 hit again. I think you wouldn't have to, if you're only going to go down to 25 and it's going to hold. So the question is, like, if that happens, is this bearish? Well, no, it's still not bearish. So if this works its way all the way to 25 and it takes that long to get down there going into August, and who knows, it took a long time to walk down here. Is it bearish? Is it still going to go to 17? You can't say it's definitely going to go. Once we get to that point, we may have more information, more measurements, but I don't see it as like a surefire, like this is definitely going to happen kind of thing. That's silly. So anyways, the bigger S-curve here, certainly you could make an argument that this is going to come all the way back down to like 650. But then you have to ask the question, is that warranted? Well, if it's going to spring, yeah, because it made a bottom here at $9. It wouldn't have to go that low. It could probably just dip slightly below it. But that S-curve is in the right place. If you ask me whether I think it's correct or not, I'm probably going to say I think it's correct unless something changes. I totally think that could be possible. Oh, but that's too bearish. No, it's not. It's really not. This motion right here, this is a jump over a massive resistance. And thus far, we haven't even come back even close to testing that resistance again. I think if you build a reaccumulation, you don't have to go all the way down to test that trend resistance, right? I'm not calling a creek because it crossed up and over it. You don't have to come all the way back down. That's a silly thing to say. But if it did, it gives you the opportunity to have a retest of that $10 level, which is very, very important. And at the end of the day, yeah, this could be an auto reaction right here down to 960s. And then this is a long creek forming and another big push. It's totally reasonable to come back down and retest the floor again. Or even to have this be a phase B top and to come down and make a spring. What bothers people about that is A, that's really low. So they immediately tune it out if they just think that this is not possible. And then B, what bothers people about that is it takes a long time. It takes longer than they want. But I've been fairly adamant on this idea that whatever happens, it seems like March 2026 at the latest, and I've said February more often than not, that's really where the big pop is. Even if we went down low, that's still where I would place it, you know? So don't be super short-sighted about it. Any kind of downside here, whether it's a local spring or a larger one. And again, from an iterative standpoint, it is supported, this idea that we're talking about, because if you look, this pop, the auto reaction goes all the way back to like 17.59. Okay, well, if we go back to 17.59 here on the small picture, that could mean, potentially, that on the big picture, which again is a version of this, on the big picture, you're going to come all the way back to 950. Why not? I mean, it may seem unreasonable, but then you're like, well, technically it's just a bigger version of this smaller guy. Like, it's doing the same things. So I don't know. There's a part of me that's like, yeah, it does seem unreasonable. But I also know, like, in the back of my head that we've talked about this quite a bit over the last year. And I don't see it as completely ridiculous sentiment. Some people think it's ridiculous. I think that GME is a question of, just like AMC, I honestly think it's a question of iterative consistency. Is the behavior on this pattern consistent with what we've seen in distribution or accumulation? Well, if you're not sure, then you're not sure. Right now, it's more consistent with distribution because, again, this push-up does make a higher high here. So now it has to kind of prove that it's not going to go backwards. I'm going to redraw it. So it has to prove that it's not going to come back down through here. But it also had this problem where it actually flushed up first anyways. So you have essentially like an uncertainty in the market at this moment where it dropped low and then it pushed high. You're expanding the range and you're trying to test. Good news is when it pushed low, though it did go through this support, arguably, well, it got close. I don't think it actually went through it. So that would be a hidden divergence on this weekly if it didn't go through it, because then the RSI did come down. I don't know. What's the low? Low is 2073. Low is 2073. So it double bottomed. But yeah, that's still a hidden divergence because the RSI is lower. The bottom was the same. Anyways. So right now, there's just kind of a question mark of what's the appropriate response here to this price action. I think the appropriate response is to wait and just see what happens, because it's not really certain to me that this is definitely going to come back through here. But would I say that normally if this came up over the top multiple times, could that be distribution? Possibly. You know, and then you'd have to have a drop here at some point. I don't know exactly what that looks like or how long it takes, but you'd have a drop here and then it'd probably come back down to the bottom. So my point in saying this was to say that, look, if that happens and you think that that's a reasonable action for a potential spring, great. Maybe that's the spring. Maybe that's where it happens. Maybe it doesn't go back down low. But the truth is that this has already been established as the norm on the bigger picture as well, because you have the same, essentially the same setup, right, on the bigger picture that's just much larger. So this first creek that was established here, right, would be met on the rebound. And then this creek that's established here would be met on the rebound. But again, this being kind of an ever-evolving thing, you kind of have to just take it in stride when you see this motion happen. So I don't find this to be particularly controversial to say, like, well, if that made a weakness, it could break down here. That seems really straightforward. Then the next question is it able to continue and break out and go to all-time highs? Well, maybe if it does do that. So that's why I'm not even sure they're going to break down through here at all. Because again, if this kind of leads to a greater drop, it has to be justified. And I think if you look at this again from that perspective, it's pretty easy to see that, like, yeah, that could be a bit of a problem. That drop would be very significant, perhaps in the long term. So if we see that happen, it makes an argument. I guess it opens up the door for this idea that from a bigger iteration standpoint, this could end up being quite a mess. Let me show you what I mean. We talked about this, and I said it was what made me the most nervous was that big upthrust that happened here in this middle zone, which is very strange. It's very out of place, in my opinion. So this is like your iterative motion, right? And if you drive this backwards and you shrink it, then as best as you could kind of do it, right? This is obviously not perfect. You would say that you're probably in a motion of, again, without being overly complicated about it, you're probably in this first motion on the bigger picture, which doesn't really say much. I mean, it kind of means that, okay, well, it could come back down and then react again. And that's not really that helpful, is it? Remember that, like, usually these waves have purpose. So there's a purpose to this. It's not just a bunch of fractal bars. That'd be pointless. This is where we were trying to go last week and never really finished. But this motion right here would hold purpose. It can't just be like in a vacuum, right? There's a reason it's going back to hit certain markers. So you have to kind of make that argument on a grander scale, right? And I honestly think it's kind of just doing the same thing over and over again. Here and here and here and here and here, all the way down. And I think that's probably a good thing in the long run. You want to see a big move, you usually see that shrinking. But so the backup here, this could signal like that first backup that happened. This is where things get kind of dicey. I have to like explain it this way. So let's say, for example, this is what you think. You think that you're currently, and I'll just do it this way. Let's say in theory, right, you think that you're probably iterating in the same manner where you're going to jump the first wave like we did right here in October and we did right here in April, right? So you're going to jump that wave and you're going to build out an upward, and you might have a second motion that's even higher than the first, because technically here on the small scale we had an up thrust that pulled back and then it has this kind of advancement. Well, again, this kind of causes a lot of headaches for me because I'm like, well, there's a lot going on there in that statement. One thing you would say is, well, then it doesn't just drop right now. You'd probably say that the next thing that happens is that it actually goes up again. This holds, perhaps into August. And then it probably goes up again, and it may even make a higher high, just like we saw right here. You would see this on like a bigger picture. Like this could even make a higher high. Maybe it doesn't come back up to all-time highs, but it would probably at least come back up above 74. And that kind of completes this cycle right here, this motion right here of iterative push up, like we're exhausting buyers and so on and so forth, right? This is like one example of how you could interpret this and be pretty accurate about it, I think. So this gives you an August run up. What it doesn't give you, of course, is it doesn't give you a January or February run up. And this is where I was like really worried, because I thought when we were doing this last week, I was like, well, technically, if this were to come down into near February again, it could go down like kind of long term, just like it did here. And I'll try to mark this off with like a color or something so you can see what I'm talking about. So this motion really matches the same motion, right? You're talking about that drop, return back to that wave, right? And this is like the bigger wave that hasn't actually finished yet. And specifically what this did was it dropped through what we would consider to be an ice level. Well, where's the ice level here? It doesn't seem to exist. That's not true. It's just evolving. It's actually still there. It's right here. So just because it hasn't kind of shown itself perfectly yet doesn't mean it's not there. It's probably here, and it may be even further back, because using and utilizing this, there's kind of a difference. This obviously pointed down, this pointed up, so on and so forth. We can keep going on this, but I think it's like probably this one. I think they're using that initial support and using that as like essentially like your ice level. So the idea would be you drop down through here, and then randomly, this is where I think there's a bit of an issue, somewhere around like January or something. This is a really silly way to look at the charts, by the way, because I'm using the micro to inform the macro, which isn't exactly the best idea, but I'm doing it anyways because I'm giving you an example of like how you might interpret this. So you might say, well, I think it's going to have that pump in February, but this kind of puts it in like a different light, where that pump in February doesn't actually appear to be very strong. Another way to interpret this and understand it is that if you look at this bounce, these are two tops right here. So there was a top back here, remember, that defined that creek? Then it runs into that top and it retreats, you know? Okay, this is getting kind of complicated, Booksy. A little bit, but remember, like, that's still here. Like, there's still a top right here. It would be right there where it needs to distribute. Again, everything kind of makes sense. Everything's in the pocket where it should be. If you're going to have that sell-off there, you would do it right at the top. That's the same place you'd have a buy-in for an SOS. So it's a very great place to do it because it's very confusing, right? It's just a marker, right? It's that little pocket zone. And then even more so, there's probably a waveform right there that would signify where that's likely going to be. We can see right here it's going into August. So I think there's a lot of positives here. It's possible it's like a pivot that you're going to be lower and then it breaks out, whatever, later. But all of this makes sense to me. But then there's this kind of curiosity where when it comes back up in this upthrust that just happened in March, weirdly, it actually comes back to like a widening that was developing. So probably better again to push this a little bit sooner, maybe into early August, because I have this timing off. There's a widening that was developing up top. I don't really see that. I see a widening right here going up, but then I also see that as the same as I see this. So you've basically got like an M cross that comes way, way, way high, right? And then pushes down low and has a strong reaction. And I see this as basically the exact same thing on the big picture. So if we're looking at this and we're saying reasonably that does make some sense here, then the big picture, it also makes sense that reasonably this could be like, again, an early cross up or a final move with this kind of early cross up would also make sense. Now, I don't want to go way farther than that on this because like we spent a whole day on this and it didn't end up panning out the way I wanted it to, mostly because I just couldn't find the answer that I wanted. I really wanted the answer, but I didn't really get the answer. One thing I would say, though, is that the measurement here is very much a one-to-one thing. Look at the distance. Actually, that's dang perfect. Look at the distance here on the M cross down. You see that drop ledge? Let me scoot this down a little. You see the drop ledge here after the bounce out? That ledge is very important because it then defines where the top is when it comes back up. It's the same thing that we see right here. And this is like the major wave down, right? And then it compresses low. The same thing happens, except of course this makes a higher high. It's more upward, but it's the exact same concept. As it broke down right there and then drives back up and over, and then it makes this double advancement really high. Now, we could say maybe that's already happened. I don't know. But one thing I would say is the timing actually, it reinforces the idea that this should be up in August, which is, again, that's kind of contrary to what I just said, where you would see it going down into August. If it did go down, it would purely be for the point of going back up again, is what that kind of concludes. So see that this wave is actually very even keel week to week. This is like a perfect one-to-one wave. The last downward candle right there before the breakout is directly in the center of that timing. Do the same thing here, and you see that, and I'm going to do it like exact. You would see where's the last downward candle before the breakout. Right there. Maybe this one, maybe this one. You've got like 2 weeks here, because you could question, well, when did it actually jump over? We could question that. It doesn't seem to jump over the creek until 1-2 weeks after that bottom. But just in this sort of so we could err on the side of caution and give it another couple weeks. Maybe I'll do 2. But just to have it, because that will add a lot of time. But like, to keep it consistent, I'm going to use the last bottom candle, not the one where it jumped necessarily. And then that gives us a timing, and that gives you a time frame, again, a cyclical time frame that makes perfect sense. This is September 2nd. That's right on the nose, guys. And this is September 22nd. Why do you think that's right on the nose, Booksy? Because the 2-year cycle was what I've been using as a metric for AMC for a while, and it starts September 6th. Started right here, right there on September 6th. 2 years, it dropped into this range down low. 2 years, it'll come back up through it. Well, does that mean it's breaking out here in 2 years, low or high? And I don't know. We've talked about 2 different possibilities, but I think it's the low is going to break and it's going to be running up by that time. I don't necessarily think it's going to be up higher than like $9 to $10, unfortunately. I've kind of changed my mind about that because the shift and all these other things going on. I went back and looked at 1240, and I've lowered my target multiple times, but I genuinely think they're using a shifted pattern, and it makes sense. It actually makes more sense than the higher pattern at this point because of where they may want to trade from 5 to 9. I don't think they're necessarily going to go way high, but the point is that 2-year cycle goes back to September. So this is very, very clean, like 50-50. It's this pocket that we were looking at a second ago. So that would suggest to me that there is a bigger wave here. Well, how does that line up with the other chart you did? It lines up perfectly because in the end, what we talked about was that these were shrinking iterations, but that if you divide them, this is the middle of like a bigger wave, and then this is the middle of a smaller wave. And it certainly looks like that. If you look at the peak here to the peak here, look at where the middle is and just make up your mind. I don't think this is actually that. I'm starting to like think of this like, oh, this was really simple actually. This is where the breakout is. It's in the center of the wave. So what does that mean? How do you know where the target's going to be? Well, I'm not 1,000% sure. I don't think anybody can be 1,000% sure about anything in life. But I would suggest to you that at the bare minimum, it would be right here at $57 because it would need to come up and maybe reach this marker again. And then at higher, it could be a little bit higher than that. There's really like 2 pockets we're talking about. One is 65 to 75, and the other is maybe this 48 all the way up to 57. Neither of those seems particularly high, I know. But if we're just talking about this as an iterative model, then what we're experiencing right now would be best described as the middle of the cat ear right on this top, but on the bigger picture, which essentially, if you look at this from that point of view, again, it kind of makes sense. Oh, like, none of this makes sense, Bugsy. No, it does. It does. I'm telling you, this is very sensible to me. So I will say this, I don't necessarily agree with the idea then. So this is it's very easy to disprove the ideas that I just talked about. So you see the problem here? So for us to go in and say like, well, this could easily break down, really looking at this as if it's a distributive model that's going to follow through right now on that distribution. Is this potentially a long-term sign of weakness? Yes. But maybe that long-term sign of weakness isn't meant to be followed through on immediately. Maybe it's meant to be followed through on like January. That's the January move. See how easy it is to kind of move it and manipulate it based on how you interpret the waveforms. That's why when we were going through this, I kept banging my head on the wall with GME, and I finally just said, I don't think this is really worth trying to be overly predictive. I think you just have to read the chart because we don't know if 25 is going to hold. If 25 holds, there's really no reason to think it's going to, I mean, I know it sounds dumb because you're like, well, if that number holds, it's like saying if you don't go below 1, you ain't going to 0. Well, yeah, naturally, of course. But I think from our point of view, we are looking at this with technical analysis in mind. And what we're saying is that that's the floor. Like if it holds, there's really no expectation of 17, period. And I don't think you can assume it's going to break down just because AMC is going down. GME did not go down. I've said this repeatedly. GME did not go down when AMC was going for a spring here. GME was going up. So if you really wanted to go like hardcore, look at September here, and that's the time period. I've talked about this before, but this is the time period that AMC is literally going down to all-time lows at the time. There's not a one-to-one comparison to be made. It's completely the opposite. From September 2020 until that 2021 markup, one of them is already working its way back out. The other is building a path down to a spring. GME had already hit all-time lows and jumped the creek. AMC did not. So when we look at this from that point of view and that vantage point, the setups going into that time frame were pretty different, and they're still different now going into this time frame. So one thing to consider would be like, well, does that mean it's just going to break out here? It's possible. But you just said, I know what I just said. You just said it's going to do this. All I can do is tell you like, no, what I'm telling you is this is the way it goes if the waveform does the same thing, which is weird, right? And it is weird. It would be strange. But if it does the exact same thing we see here on the micro, then what this does is it breaks down. You can see that there's an S-curve right here that's met, which is a big picture one, if we're going to look on the big picture. This guy isn't abandoned. It does come up there, and eventually, especially if it does do this, right? This means that this ultimately was in mind looking backwards, and this is the bigger S-curve that we used. So what that means is if this were to do the exact same thing, which would be kind of strange, but if it was, then it's possible that January isn't actually this big move that everybody expects, albeit could be. Technically, we don't know how this is going to look. There'd have to be some kind of a change at some point, right? I don't know. Maybe this happens earlier and it leads into February or something like that. But what I'm trying to suggest is that this timing is speculative anyways, so I don't know. But what I would do is I'd look at this and say that, like, well, whenever it does do this, that could be a major sign of weakness that's played out from way over here. But you have, what is the response? Well, the next motion, right? It's like this could be where it hits 13 or 12, in the future. It made that weakness just like it did here. But then what? Well, it didn't just stay down there, did it? Then it goes all the way up and meets the rising S-curve. Okay, well, let's talk about where that is on the big picture. This one comes from the M cross on the low side, and it goes right through those 2 points. This is the M cross on the low side. Arguably, we could pick out this point as the probably the main contender. I mean, you could go very high. That's extremely high. That goes all the way through the middle. That's a possibility. There's only really 2, I think. That's one. I don't really like that one very much because it cuts through, this one cuts through the middle. Maybe they're both there too down here and I'm just only using the one. This one would be like higher up like that. That makes sense because then it's giving you like a projection. So this kind of meets where the drop is right there. And then that ultimately might meet where the top is later. I don't know, that could work. So we could still have 2 here. So you can see why this works, because when you start expanding it out, if you think of this as, oh, this is the way that GME trades, and you start getting a picture of, okay, well, then actually the micro is following what is a macro picture, right? I'm thinking about where that needs to be. Should be on this one here, right there. So what that would mean is that in the end, when this comes back up, it'd be coming back up. I don't know why it would go to 2000, but that might be a bit ridiculous. But that is where the marker is. Probably would have used, or should have used, maybe that one instead. I think that's a little more reasonable. So I'm looking at that drop and then that drop instead of that point. So anyways, so this would suggest that at some point you're going to wave up to here, right? Wait, really? Yeah. How do we know? When would that happen? I guess, and it's a guess. I guess you could do an S-curve from the bottom, but you'd have to know like where this breakdown is. We don't know where that is. It's somewhere like right here. The breakdown would be like right there. That's pretty far. That's probably the best estimation I could do on it. At least from this chart. I might have to do a completely different method. I think we've done this before, and it came out that the upward did look like it could be that late, but we've done it other times where it's like, yeah, that's pretty far, man. The future. This is December 2028. This is way out there. This is very slow. But, I mean, it makes more sense, I guess, in some ways. Does it? I don't know. Well, I mean, maybe there's a reason it's going to take that long. I don't know. I'm not sure what the reason would be. It wouldn't look like this, though. It wouldn't be like that kind of emotion. It would actually look more like again, like that S-curve. You'd have some kind of a jump. Actually, yeah, that actually looks really neat because it goes this way. Now it creates a big, oh, there's like a big SOS resistance. That kind of makes sense then. This is weird though, because then proportionally, this actually goes all the way up to the top. See, we're broken. We broke it already. See how this goes up to the top of the all-time high? That would be like, why are we going way above the all-time high? It should have been here. Like at the latest. And it could exceed it, but it wouldn't go. That's where it's got to be. See, I did something wrong. Measured somewhere wrong. Nah, I mean, that looks pretty good. I think this curve is causing me some headaches because it's not really working how I want it to. This peak is almost like the middle. Weirdly. So that'd be like saying this peak is the middle. That's very strange. But then again, that makes it easier because it wouldn't change. So that would be like the center, and that would still be the center here. That's a long time. Oh, that's the same. That's like the same measurement. That's still 2028. Yeah, but I mean, it is what it is. Yeah, we don't know what we don't know. So that's a dumb thing to say sometimes. But in this case, we don't know what the end would look like yet because we haven't seen it happen. So we could speculate based on what happened here, how there could be a similarity in the motion of the drop down, because this has a double M and then rockets up to where that top is. And I know people want to say it's all random, but it ultimately, where they pulled the buy button is right where that marker should be. So again, perhaps it's all random. That's creepy that it's kind of right in that pocket too, that trajectory. It's starting to feel like really reasonable. Maybe this ends up being the main one, you know, right there. But what we can do is like look at that as like a potentially as a model for how the bottom's built out. There's an M cross and then this rockets up to the top. And I think you got the same thing here. There should be an M cross and then it rockets up to the top. And there is, it's right there. If we take that to the top, but this really only follows through on this angle. It doesn't follow through on that. If we drop it down to here, it's another important marker, but it didn't follow through. I take it back. That's still pretty high. What the? 600. That's a weird pocket. There's a lot going on in that direction. I'm bad at this part. I got to be honest. I just don't know which one to pick. Anyways, the point is, after the middle here breaks down and it goes back up to that point, it looks like it's going to do it again right here. So we're really looking at a very, I think at this point, like I know that I do a lot of lines and junk, but when we triangulate this, I genuinely think this is correct. I think we're looking at a very significant window here going into August. It's like almost infallible. There's just nothing that really shows another direction in this particular case. Sometimes it's all over the place, but for GME, it's like it's definitely in this little pocket. But what's curious is then on the big picture, those same markers are starting to show signs. This is actually way later. And I had previously thought it was going to be a lot earlier. So, but it's just where they are. So what this would do is this would be like you've touched the creek right here, which we did. This would be a creek advancement, very similar to what we see here to some degree. Like you have an advancement over the top, but then it doesn't follow through. Instead, you back up, which is, again, there's a lot of similarities here. and then it backs way, way up. But the bigger problem here is the timing on this middle, which I don't know if we can find. And then you'd have a, let's see, this produces like a really clean double top example, because then you have like on the bigger picture, these two and then these two. So you have a 1, 2, and then you have a 3, 4, and the 4 goes too high, which causes it to sell back down. It pushes over the top of it, but does not advance. It fails, just like this one doesn't quite work. But then you end up building out a new creek. And once that's broken, and that's where things get kind of dicey, because if this goes up in February, this kind of follows along with AMC though, because AMC had that push up that looked really good, but then it doesn't go. I know it's all kind of backwards here, because you're thinking, well, why wouldn't it just keep going up? This is nothing like the other one, Booksy. I know. But bear with me. I think we're going to finish it in a second. Really do. Because this actually has that up thrust in January, but then it comes down again. I don't know if it makes an SOW or not, but it'd have to come back down through the bottom to some degree, at least down low somewhere. Maybe it holds up above 25 or something if it comes back. I don't know. These don't have to be in the same order. Like this made a low after the push, but it could make a low before the push. Who knows? If it needs to change character there and have an advanced buy-in where there's a lot more players in it, they might do that. But behavior-wise, that's what happened. So you've got kind of a double top here, you've got a double top here, but then this guy, after it makes that low, it breaks out. It goes all the way up to the lower top, which is this one. So it would go all the way back to this peak in like one fell swoop. It would be a pretty significant move all the way back up. But then, unfortunately, this goes higher than that, so this would go to like 80 or something. Probably end up being this top, like 85. So this would go all the way up to like 85, which does fall in line with what we see here on that hook value. So it's like a 50-50. Drives back up to that mark and rejects, which would be this one. So it very likely comes up quite high and then probably rejects. But this time it's actually broken the higher one, which makes sense because now it's done the same thing it did here, but it's broken the higher move instead of this one. So it's like an expansion of sorts. This is an insane looking expansion. I'm aware. This may not go up that high. It's hard to say. It's basically just a bottoming structure though, but just very violent. And then it comes all the way up, and the rest of it would change. It'd have to change quite dynamically. Otherwise, I saw this before on GME and got really annoyed because it did the same thing where it had this like ever expanding motion. But let's think about it, okay? So we got all that. That's all based on like iterative build out. So at first you might say, this is insane. It'll never do this, so on and so forth. And I get it. But like just for a moment, let's just take a look and just take a look at the bigger picture motion here. And let's ask ourselves if this makes sense to some degree. Because the next motion down, I don't know exactly how this would work. It'd have to be some kind of a drop again. It's like, this is where things get really, really complicated because I'm like, wait a minute. You can't just keep doing this indefinitely, right? Because this pushes up, but it only has like a small back up here. It doesn't go all the way back down. It just goes back down to like the rising ice level, probably this one. That's, again, the same as this, where it's hitting that ice, but it's not breaking it. That's what we're saying if it goes to 25. The ice here would be like 28. And then it would go all the way up to the peak and go a little beyond it. That's where it would actually go way high And I don't know, the timing on this is hyper speculative, of course, but something like that, right? It'd break all-time highs. But unfortunately, that's where things kind of start going willy-nilly, because then you have to take it backwards again. Ugh. And that's where you do like this big sell down on some other magic wave that doesn't even exist. Not really. This one is like way off in La La Land. Oh, I haven't even done this. I don't really want to be honest. I know it's there because it was pressed against here. But how in the world are you supposed to do that? This is huge, huge, huge. That's like multi-year cycle stuff that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. You guys are like, that's like 2040. Then again, this is GME. I mean, if you're going to have a long form build out, then maybe this makes sense. I don't know. So the next markup would be significantly low because this one comes back down. If this is a weakness here, if this is read as an SOW, then it would be read as an SOW as if this one was. It's still making higher lows, so the question is why would it ever come back down? But the answer is this creek right here that's flattened out. And this is very steep. This creek comes down like at a very harsh angle right there. So it may seem ridiculous, but if this is a double top distribution, then actually kind of makes sense because this would come way back. I'm trying to see how that would work. It'd have to come all the way back down through that basin right here. Yeah, this is crazy stuff. And it's a big hook. It's a bonkers setup. This takes years. This would be like forever. Is this how it works? How the market works, Booksy? No, I don't think it necessarily works like this. Not in that way. But let's just say, for example, and then again, long term, that doesn't make sense because this is already above that high. So you're kind of like, well, where would it go then? I don't know. But let me just take a. That's what I'm saying. Ultimately, does this make sense? Probably not, because we don't know if it was a spring here and it started to rebound, does this angle actually not represent the correct angle? Right? This is like a forever, we're going to come back to $4 zone kind of thing, which I've talked about before. It is targeted, the $4 region. Shouldn't be ignored, but does that make any sense? Maybe not. It could be that the reason that's being targeted is because we're using like a less elevated wave. There could be another one that's quite elevated, like this direction. Well, that changes things clearly. Because if you did this, suddenly it's like, oh, well, we don't actually do all this stuff. We might hit here, and then maybe we come down like lower towards like $10 or something, or 17 or something a little lower. But after that, you'd be back up, right? You'd be heading back towards this top and then ultimately like pushing out again to some big number. And this makes sense to me too, because this is a rising, kind of like a rising wedge. So anyways, my point being was if you take away maybe a little bit of that extra pathage there, and let's just take a look and just see if that even looks remotely reasonable. Because usually these kind of pathways look reasonable. Yeah. So I would have looked at this and said, well, that's reasonable. This seems like it should be maybe higher, but you'd have like a push up here. That's a push against resistance. Then you jump it. You'd have a little micro SOS here, and then back up, and you go into a bigger top. That if that ends up being distributive, it would come back down. you would lose whatever ice you've created here. Yeah, this sensibly could be correct in terms of like how high this goes. If it did something like this, that direction, because you come back to that later. So this would be lost if it's broken. So if it holds its support, maybe it doesn't go down all the way. It's a different story. This is more of like a spring action here. So it jumps the creek. Yeah. If it holds that and it doesn't lose the creek, then it changes the dynamic of the story. Because you can easily have a lot of this stuff happening. That wave works out. This stays above the creek here. This is a different path. Actually, that looks right. Because you would jump... yeah. So, I mean, if we looked at this as just like a generic double top, we could even simplify it more. Instead of being a 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this actually may make more sense as to why this 4 is, or this 1, 2, this kind of middle is low. Because typically in the M, your bottom is like down here. There's like a middle that's really low, and then you come up higher when it's bullish. That actually makes sense now. Maybe that's why that's presenting itself as a low middle here. That weird SOW that we saw is actually like a middle between the two ears. So we will get a higher push, but then it ends up going into a macro middle. That's totally sensible. And then this is a push against resistance, which again on a waveform schematic makes sense. 1, 2. Yeah, I don't know. This actually doesn't seem wrong. Like when I look at it like this, the weird little like nuances, although they are weird that this is like a high push, they don't seem wrong to me. They actually seem quite nice, and they make sense. So this would have probably come back down if it distributed. Yeah, but it's not gonna just rocket to all-time highs. So, well, maybe not. But I think you can use, again, like last point of, we can just kind of test these ideas. You can use like last points of supports here where those drop downs are. You can see directional improvisation, if you will, if you want to call it that, input. You can see it going backwards here to this area. There's quite a bit of it, of information right here in terms of like where those supports are. 1, 2, 3, drop down here, and then final resistance. And that's probably as high as it's going to go on that first push. You get those pieces of information, and it's like, yeah, okay. So this could end up pushing up quite high to like 187. That's still a big move. Timing's speculative, but then you have one of two options, right? It's not like it's both. One option is that this does come down, but it holds up pretty nicely. It probably wouldn't even get close to the creek. You'd have a little bit of some kind of a weakness here. Usually it dips below that marker, and then it would, wherever that is, and then it would push up higher and sort of shoulder off, walk down. And then this comes back down, but doesn't ever really break out. And that actually works really well with this as a base. Either way. And this could technically still be a spring. Because if you saw this, even though that's really ugly, it just depends on what happens next. This would be like a SOS with a backup. Backs up to the creek. This is a questionable one right here. But I think this probably ends up being like that top. Yeah, it's actually very simple. And it looks a little complex, and I just kind of guessed where this might be, but it's possible it's there. It could be significantly higher. Because one thing is like, we don't know if this goes parabolic in the future, what that looks like. Like, that's certainly at play, but if this makes another top later on, oof, look at that one. Wow. See, to me, this is really very good. I don't see it as, oh well, you're just being bearish or something, because GME is meant to go to like 20,000. Some people get really annoyed by it, but I honestly think this is quite reasonable. If you can make a technical case for something like this, that's pretty important. And that's a very strong technical case for these levels right here. Like, really strong technical case for it. That's 2029, which is very similar to the highs we were looking at for AMC. So we thought AMC might kind of crap out a little lower than expected and then end up not being where you think it's going to be. It may not even come over like 24 or something, and then really doesn't break out big till 2029. Which is still a huge squeeze motion if you're actually paying attention to just this idea of going from 2 to 24. I mean, you're talking about 1,000% or whatever, but like this concept that people have that it's going to be this massive move, this actually does make perfect sense as a wave cross. 1, 2. I mean, gosh. Again, like, simplify it into its base parts. I can't really get rid of this because I think that advancement's important, but if you kind of simplify it into like the most basic parts, it's extremely straightforward. And it's extremely reasonable. This would not be unusual. I don't know what happens here. I think it might be safe to even assume this, but you might even say that this could actually have a secondary push here, goes higher, based on what we're seeing back here. If this advances on the first M, the second M may advance as well. It looks like it's trying to reach up and grab this ledge. Maybe it doesn't ever get there until like way over here. So a huge squeeze starts in January or in June 2026. There's a micro squeeze in January because there'd be some kind of a weird pop here, and it would go pretty far, and it looked like it comes out of nowhere. But then the rest of it doesn't start till 2026 June. So let's look at fib ratio real quick. Okay, sorry guys for spitting in the mic. So these fibs are really strong. This is a I love doing this at the end, like when it's all done and you're like, oh yeah. So right now the 3423 is a fib. This gives you the 0.5 retracement here at 880, and then the 618 at 4. Granted, if you went up higher, you might use the higher one, so you could draw that up. And I think that even better, because that actually looks more like the 530, which is this top right there. That's the middle from back here. Very, very good. So that's a pretty strong level. That's that zone. And then the 0.5 is at $12. Again, that's kind of where this ledge is, so it would make sense. Maybe it bleeds through that a little bit. Everything else is kind of where it should be. This is the 63 is the 236, and then the 382 is 26, which is here. So those levels are where they make the most. I mean, they do make sense. I could draw them a little closer to them, but then let's use a fib extension here. and see what that does. So that fits pretty well. Because most people doing these trend-based fib extensions are probably just going to use the most extreme numbers. They're like way off there, aren't they? Yeah, they're way, way up there. How else could we use that? We could do it here instead of on this, because that might be some huge macro target, like way off in the future. Maybe what you could do is use this instead. Yeah, that works. Yeah, I mean, that's the 259 is the 1414. So they're in the right place. The more common one being the 1618, but that is in the right place. That's 250, 260 by end of the year 2028, which is far away. I think it gets a little bit complicated after that. We could use so we use that right now and say, well, look, if it goes up into 2026, it should be way up here, right? And that makes sense because you're like, well, sure, it would maybe hit like 200 or something early next year. There was evidence of that. This isn't the only, it'd be silly to say like, well, this is it. This is all there is. There's nothing else. There's evidence of some other paths here. This one I find particularly interesting right there. That seems to be interacted with quite a bit right now, but doesn't really tell me it's going to definitely get anywhere. It just gives me a really good sense of like, okay, if we're distributing on top of that, it certainly makes sense. That's a long-standing trend, maybe even stronger than the actual first rejection, which is higher. That's this one. But that's the question mark I don't know the answer to. So if you use the support back here and the last point of resistance, which is on the second cat ear, it definitely looks like the trajectory that it's right where it should be in terms of fitting in that mold. Question mark again being, where does this top go? I don't know. Could be way up here at 2000, but for now, like that's sufficient because we don't really know any of this after. This may only be relevant to like 2030 or something at this chart because I don't have any clue after that. You'd have to find the levels. We're reading way too far, I think. But for the short term up to 2029, I don't think it's that wild of an idea. It certainly makes sense. But yeah, this also has a possibility that maybe that extension does what this did and goes up way higher and comes down on this, and that's not impossible either. You could have this push up to the 500 level and then come down here. It doesn't have to just like necessarily stop. We were just using the iteration. The iteration made it seem like probably would stop. But there's certainly nothing that says that couldn't happen. It's a similar motion, similar fib extensions, just different path to get there. Similar end, I mean. And that works pretty well with this idea. That this is a wave out, and then you've got this pretty big I don't think we're going to go above $80 right now. You've got this pretty big long-term retracement that would be almost inevitable. I don't know. There's a lot to it after that. I'm kind of go back and look at it, but honestly, this seems kind of reasonable to me. I think about the way in which operators trade and establishing a floor here that you may come back to after a distribution. If you end up going to like $80 and just selling off again, you can come all the way back down and you'd have that floor, which has been built quite a long time here, around 18 to 24. And you can stage whatever kind of a bounce or whatever there that you want. And then try to test lows. And then really at that point, bears are trapped and they think they're going to take it down really far. So first you sucker punch the bulls. You make them think this is going to go to all-time highs. You give them a target like my target, like the February 2026 target, the earliest ones. You show them that there's a possibility that the wave is going to continue there, and that it's there. There's a huge amount of momentum going up into that corner, but instead of following through on it, you kind of like reverse course and ends up still being a pop, but you're not getting like this massive drive. So August ends up being kind of this weirdly odd high month in this case. And this is complicated because, again, the idea of GME and AMC running parallel is kind of backwards. But it may be a reverse situation too. We don't know. Where AMC's at a low, GME's at a high, where it's like flip-flopped from the way it was here. And AMC actually builds out going into January, and GME comes down into January. It'd be kind of backwards. But they would take turns, because technically if AMC's low there, that'd be super crazy. It also depends on how that happens, because we could have a delayed action. I think when we did this on the micro, it made more sense to me, as opposed to doing it big picture only. As GME could have a little bit more upside and then come down. And August is really that time of like testing. So it could still have some up here in the next week or so and then come down into August and then just rip with AMC. They both go up into September, but then that's it. That's like the move. And that does meet at the right time in like early September. That's the cycle. And that was correct timing wise on both. Both are like September, 3rd and 6th, GME and AMC respectively. And then you have a sell down period on both. But in this case, oddly, AMC chops sideways going into February more so than GME does. In this example, GME would come down like it did here. And I wonder about the rest of this. I'm not sure. Maybe the goal is to give it some kind of a cyclical meaning. So maybe it is June. And we all think it's going to be February. February is like a non-starter. I think about things a lot from like an iteration perspective and like what that would look like. I think that could be right. And this doesn't even have to go that low. This could come back down to like here. As long as it broke that trend, wherever that is, then it's probably fine. Yeah, so it's really like a consolidation down. This is slow. It only takes till June 2026. Something may have changed as well, but there would be like a 50-50 idea here. I think this has to go halfway. So where's the halfway point? It is right there. So S curves up really big. Actually, that follows, because if you have a double top here, you're going to have two markers. This is very simple to me. I know it seems complex, but you would have two hits here. One would be the hit on the top, and then another would be this hit on the bottom, and that would generate two different trajectories down. And that's exactly what you would look for in a S curve, because you'd have you'd have to have some kind of a breach of the first, but then you'd also have like a breach of the second, and then the finishing of the S curve. So you'd end up with something in the middle. right in this area. This is where you'd hit that resistance between the two. It doesn't always have to be like that, but it would make, again, does it make sense? Yeah, it makes sense. That's the main motion up because of that. So you'd have this S curve to the upside here, which matches this guy. And we just don't know if it's going to make another pop. So good news, I guess, is if this makes another pop to the upside right now, and it does a decent little pop right here, just like we were saying on AMC. AMC has this possibility, for whatever reason, they did not go as far as they could have gone with the on balance. If it has another pop here and goes to like 5 something, which is kind of crazy, and then it drops down, if GME has another pop here, that's actually a really good sign for later, because it means that, yeah, for later on, because it means that later on, this is likely going to go, it's kind of, again, it's kind of complex, but it basically means that like likely it's going to go way higher than at least these two tops. Yeah, right here. This is still kind of bound though, isn't it? It's still like within the parameters. I'm always trying to think about like what's being accomplished from a liquidity standpoint. And like $40 was this ledge, it was this closing value back here. If it hits $40 and then drops, when we get to the next layer, that's like us maybe hitting like 60, because I'm looking back here at like where would that be? The consolidation is building it downward towards like 60. Which is too low. It's got to be higher than that, though. Well, then again, it's like comparing this area and this area. Those are two different, completely different markers. This is an M down, and then another one. It's like the high and then the low. The high would be way up here, and the low would be down here. In this case, we're only using the high. We're not using the low. So actually, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It follows through. So it'd follow through on like, yeah, again, coming up to like 80s. So we may even want to see this go beyond. We may want to see it hit like 45 or something. Because then later that gives us a chance to see this kind of bleed up. Maybe overestimating that S curve. Anyways, regardless, it'd be nice to see one more big push. I think that gives us more evidence for later that we're going to come up significantly higher. This is a bizarre one though, because if we do this early, it's actually, in some ways, it's better for us, even though we want the bigger push. I think it's healthier. So, like, short term, it wouldn't feel as nice, but it'd probably be better to go down than up. But we may do an up, down, up. And if we do that, it's going to be really volatile before August, which means that this later would be probably highly volatile as well. Up, down, up. Yeah, and then down, up again, which means there'd be like another drop here. Probably to come all the way back down and check. Yeah, it'd be this creek. This is the first push. Backs up, runs up high, drops back. First push, backs up, runs up high, drops back. But it doesn't go back to the top here. I guess we don't know that yet. It could. Maybe it won't go that low. That would actually be nice to have like a backup that only goes down to like 33, as opposed to going all the way back down to, Either one works, but it's like 25 or 33, right? Obviously, we'd prefer to only have 33. So there's so many different ways this could happen. We could drop down and hit 26 and then run all the way to 45 and then stay above because we'd already checked it. We could avoid the check altogether and just not check it and go up to 45 and then back up to 33 and then run again. Or we go all the way up to 44 and then sell really hard all the way back down. And all of those are the same they give you the same bullish outcome, but they kind of change what maybe we would see happen later. They make it sounds really different, but only in like the future would it make the huge difference. In the short term, it would just be more volatility versus less volatility and whether you make the checks or not. It would drastically change what we would do here though, in terms of volatility. Because in this first example, it would be like you going all the way back down to like $40 after hitting like 120, which is really far, and then doing some kind of huge squeeze after the fact, which is kind of bonkers sounding, but that's where it would be. And then the other one, it's not nearly that volatile. It would only go to like maybe 68. And that seems a lot more reasonable to me than having some huge backup. But, I mean, GME's swings are pretty magnificent. They're humongous swings, so I'd shrug my shoulders about that. I'm not sure. All of this is pretty, as you were aware, speculation, and it's really based on principled understanding of like what this wave is doing. I don't think any of this is particularly wrong, because if I can punch holes in it, I will. What really registers here is this, right? Is this kind of idea of like, well, if you make this support high, you're going to have this new creek here, and that develops really well later into a backup. So there's certainly evidence here that this is going to work. But even without that, it's like, well, we already have one right here. Like, this is already created like a progressive creek right here. So it's done. It's not a question anymore. So like the concept of moving back and then jumping, either one, is very nice. Like, they work very well. Very nice. Yeah, both of them work really well. They don't feel good, but they work really well. Why wouldn't you just have it kind of LPS and go up and LPS and go up? I think that comes down to your understanding of timing in the market and what you think has to happen based on certain things. I don't think it has to be a particular length of time. So what I'm looking at is, if this does what it did here, then this is what happens. That's it. So it's just purely behavioral. Like, if it's doing the same thing, it's the same algorithm, whatever you want to call it. If this is the behavior of the stock and how we're going to trade it, this is how you expand that to a macro analysis. And it works very well to get you to where you want to go. But, of course, you understand that, yeah, I mean, the reason we're saying that is because until you see this kind of work out, you don't have every single point. Like, I don't have this high, right? I'm just using triangulation and trajectory and all this other stuff and the current resistances, et cetera, to best estimate where I think that is. In reality, once we have that high, then it's no longer a fiction. It's like this. Once you have that creek, it's just there. You check it or you don't, right? And then you decide what happens if you don't. That's all there is to it. And if you do, and it's successful back test of that support, then you're good to go, right? So everything else here is really just a reaction, if you think about it, off of that concept of, well, we haven't yet done this, or we will have done that, and this and that and the other. None of this is, in my mind, illogical. It's perfectly logical, but it's also still speculative because you're still making a lot of assumptions about things like you don't know for a fact that's where it's going to be, right? Simple. So don't go too crazy on this. I spent most of the time here on GME, but I've only been streaming a couple hours today. I like this chart. I don't necessarily think it's the best one ever, but it's okay. There's a different potential for outlook. I like to think about this as again, a wave cross. Then it makes sense. This is like a 1, 2, but then in the middle you have an M cross that jumps up and over. And usually you'll see a 1, 2, 3, 4 in the middle. And this definitely feels like that, like a 1, 2, and then you're low, and then a 3, 4, and you're high. And that's really what I was getting at with this blue line is it's actually a very straightforward understanding of the market. Super simple. So don't hear it as, well, I have to know how to do all this stuff, or this guy's crazy, does he expect people to believe? I don't care if you believe it or not. It's just the concept of like where those resistances are is lining up quite neatly with what they've done on the smaller picture. So it's expanding in a very proportional way, the way that this iteration has gone from, this is a small analysis like of trajectories and all this stuff to a larger one. And I got to tell you, of the two, GME has been a lot more consistent in terms of building out on its trajectories and stuff. So you might think that, again, this is kind of off the wall bonkers. This guy's kind of crazy, right? But I mean, like these trajectories have been fairly consistent over time, the ideas that are presented may seem a little bit out there, but like everything is fairly tight on GME. When we've done those trajectory markups, they almost always hit if you do them right. And that's the key, right? And I think I've done them right fairly constantly on GME in the last year. I don't think I've pulled out a trajectory to the upside that hasn't worked. I just haven't. Like they've all worked. Like the move from 20 to 30, and then the second move from like 21 to 28, and then the final move from 20 to 35. Like all of those were trajectory-based, S-curve-based moves, sine wave-based moves. So the operator is not really hiding a lot here, which is kind of nice. I think on the opposite side of that, AMC has been very tricky. It has a lot more delay action. It hasn't followed through as often, maybe. It makes it a little difficult. But GME has been very consistent in that regard. So I'm just saying, something to think about. Yeah, 1, 2, back up, middle is low, and then you get a massive move with a 3, 4. Even on the RSI, it's kind of, this is the one thing that I kind of get stuck on. I always get like a hiccup on it, but it's always like this idea of like, well, is it working on all time frames? And often with the waves, I get kind of stuck up on the idea of like what, especially with RSI, like what is constituting a hit. This looks like it backed up already and hit it, which should give you an extra push, right? And that's what we're saying. We're not saying this breaks down necessarily to 17 yet. That could be later. But like, it's curious to think about this as like a 1, 2, and then you've got to have like a 3, 4 that kind of climbs and breaks out here. And that's what's trying to happen, 3, 4. So the 3 and the 4 may be more of an appearance to us of like a middle. And in the end, we might see this top over here as more of like the 3, 4. And this might be like a middle. But regardless, this is like the smaller M cross in the middle. And then you have the same thing on the big picture, 1, 2. But you have this breakout, this breakdown in the middle. So it's curious because I'm like, well, if you're looking at this from an RSI standpoint, this advancement is certainly weaker. You might see it push quite high here if it pushes to 80. It reminds me of what happened with AMC. It went the RSI went really, really, really high on this last move. It was as high as it was on the 4-hour, maybe on the daily. I can't remember which one I was looking at, but it was as high as it was in a year ago. The move was 300% back then. It was not 300% now. But the reason it was higher is because they did all of the price action during the trading day. And they did so much of a move. They did so much of a move in pre-market and after hours trading last time that the RSI never got really overcooked. Now it did get overcooked, but they were able to move it 300%, right? Which is insane. And it's kind of the same thing we're seeing here. Like this RSI got pretty overcooked, but I'm wondering if it's because a lot more, and especially right now, this came back up again and it got overcooked again. I'm wondering if it's going to do something similar where this is going to pump really high on like a U shape here. I think we've got this correct, by the way. I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I wonder if this is going to pump up. Yeah, that's tooting your horn, Booksy. I wonder, though, if this is going to pump up pretty high, even though it doesn't go that far, because it's going to do more of it during regular trading hours and, like, let it hike up. And then the downward motion, gosh, it's all right where it should be here. It's, like, perfect. See how that's a low? It really is, like, spot on. Yeah, and then the downward motion is a like an S curve. Drives the price like way back down. How far is this going to take? I don't know. Timing is speculative. We could probably keep measuring waves, but looking like summer, this will be way back down here. And look at that on the big picture. It's like such a clean jump. So if the middle here on the micro is like this portion, and then you have this massive boost, then the middle on the macro would be this portion. Then you have this like massive boost, right? Would you know? Yeah, actually, this should push it down even further, because it'd be like saying this guy was the first. This is double M. Down, double M, down. So the downward motion, this will have a move down here, and it'll be lower probably than most people are comfortable with. But then this is going to end up being like the big push. I wonder if there'll be like a huge divergence or something at that point. If this came lower, it would. That'd be like this one. This has a divergence. The price is higher. The RSI came down. So it wouldn't surprise me if the RSI is actually significantly low. And then the price doesn't actually come that low. That's actually pretty one-to-one. And then the remaining price action would be this kind of massive push back up. Oof. Yeah, so from an iterative perspective, it totally works. That's kind of crazy. Yeah, that is crazy. I think this could end up being like astronomically high. I'm trying to think about how like the this top plays and everything. The top would matter. I'm not sure yet. I don't know. See, that's the first one. Is it this? Is it going to go back up to this like hook level? Which would be where on the chart? That's the drop zone. Again, I'm trying to poke holes in it. It's the lower drop, which is this one. One of these two bars right here. This one. Doesn't really help though. Can't see it. This guy. Oh, that's really nice. That's a good wave right there. That's weird how, like, when you go back to the daily, it looks very clearly like that's the foretop right here, because you can see that drop down, but it's really hard to tell because it just looks linear. But then look at this, that wave. It's like the arc is like perfect right here. I think that's wild. I think that's really cool. Anyways, there was a point to this though, which is I was looking at the build out here going up. I went to a smaller time frame on purpose because I wanted to see it where it was. That goes all the way to the bottom. But I was really looking at, yeah, it's the bottom wick right there. Okay, so it's the low. Well, that makes it easy. We definitely know when that is. That would be somewhere around here. It's this guy. So from here to here. Uh-oh. So you're like, it already hit it. Yeah, it did. But maybe we can still use the weekly somehow. No, it's not possible to use the weekly there. Well, it's not possible to use the same points because there's no bottom there. There's definitely a cross, but I can't tell. Like, it's way up there somewhere. I think it'd be better to do this because it's the same idea of like that support where that drop ledge is, and that intersection does, this is the same. So it's like multiple paths sort of the same end. It should be the same. That's February, dude. Oh, man. What does that mean? Is it just going to keep going up until February? Maybe we're wrong about I don't know. The timing of it was definitely August. It was like September 3rd. What if it runs from September 3rd all the way through like February? That's kind of slow. Well, just because that's the pivot doesn't mean anything. It could easily be like a breakdown level. I've talked about that before. Because like if you look at 2021 to 2020, yeah, going backwards, and you look at that November breakdown, it is a trajectory-based breakdown, but if you use the market, that looks like the peak, and it is. It's the peak in the market. So the waves are like offset, and it really is breaking down by that point. And I've said that before, like this idea of it being high by February 2026, because I'm cautious about this idea of guaranteeing, obviously, that that's what I think happens. It's more of a question of like, well, I don't know for sure, and we may have something of this kind of like a breakdown at that point. It might be like the final high. Just like back here, this was the final high going into November for the market. The market was like peaking here, but GME and AMC had already hit their highs and consolidated, and that's consistent with this. Like this kind of giant push up and then this back up, and it's already consolidating by the time it hits that peak area in February. So there's a question mark in my head about that. Like I'm wondering if that ends up being the case, where we get I don't know. I guess the RSI could come up higher. It's not impossible, but we end up getting some kind of a shakeout period here from September through February. Yeah, this is very consistent. AMD's breaking out. I just noticed that. Looked at the numbers. AMD processing. It just jumped its creek. Made two bottoms coming off this 4-hour 180. Jumped the creek. Perfectly came back and tested it at 108. Now it seems to be trying to advance. I had marked off two possibilities. One is that somewhere this comes above, hits that and goes. The other obviously drops from there. It has the possibility it could slide back through, so you can't necessarily say, it's not possible, but it'd have to be like a head fake. Looks like there's maybe a gap down here at like 110. I'm not super concerned about that. I think it's a 5-wave, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm really looking at that 5th wave. I'm just switching gears now. I'm looking at that 5th wave being very similar to the first. So I think it's going to be all the way up to like 140. And that makes sense. There's a long-term gap way up here at 140. That's back near the end of the year levels going into 2025. So it looks pretty good. And then I'm thinking that Apple's another one I've been keeping my eye on. And there's a lot of people that picked up some interest in it because I said it may go to 300, which sounds kind of ridiculous. This is a complicated one that I did not go through last week. I said bare minimum what I needed to say about it. The reason it's complicated is because the iteration pathway is not defined yet. So you find that there's this junction coming up around June 6th through the 9th. And I know the 6th is Friday, and then the 9th is on Monday. But the way this is working is it could have a low that's essentially like a spring. It could come just slightly below 192 in spring. It may come lower than that and still be a spring, but there's a certain nuance to it, right? You have to be careful with that if it did come low. But that is a possibility. So one of the things I was concerned about when I talked about this is that there's no black and white yet. I knew that it was going to come up again. That much I knew. So I had drawn it back here, and I said, I think it's going to come back up and then maybe lay back down. But this has to be like kind of a double top motion, and then we'll see what happens going into the end of the week. But I'm telling y'all this because if it breaks out, then what happens on this iteration is it goes from like 200 to 300 pretty rapidly, all things considered, by about August, which again may seem a little bit out there, and I did not pick August on purpose. So if you're wondering yeah, you picked August because it's, the same time as, no, I really didn't. Yes, that's earnings season, July into August. So there might be a reason why we're seeing that as a commonality. I did not pick August 6th because of AMC though. I specifically looked at the timing of the details. So I looked at the details and I built out the structure. And it's not, everything I do always looks super complicated, but if you were doing it with me, you'd be like, okay. Because what I'm doing is I'm taking this as a micro iteration of this guy, as a micro iteration of this guy, and it's the same motion as the bigger picture. It's this drop with this rebound motion. And then I'm taking that as a smaller version of with this drop rebound motion. I'm actually looking at this as this is the drop rebound. This is the same top motion that we have right here, and it is. So what I'm seeing is this kind of a drop and then bounce motion, drop, bounce motion that's making higher highs, but it's also compressing down, which is usually really bullish because when you start looking at then the breakout targets, everything kind of clicks into place. there's a sense in which this is staying very elevated, right? Even though, frankly, Apple's had nothing but kind of bad news, and it's even being talked about like it doesn't even need to be part of the Mag 7, which is silly. It's still like the number 3 stock or something. But I find it to be a curious case of like, well, it's delayed for sure, but it has this kind of like hidden bullishness to it. There's a widening on the RSI here while we're kind of compressing down. And we've got a similar motion on like the big picture where it's been like building out this widening. It could have one more downside on this widening, which is, again, I'm like leaving a door open because it hasn't committed to it yet. But if this iteration follows through to the upside, then the next iteration right here follows through to the upside. It's going to go to 300. Like, that's as easy as it is. Because the breakout here isn't just a break of like an iteration or a micro iteration. When you start doing the 50-50 lineup from bottom to middle to top, and then you do the next one, bottom to middle to top, it goes all the way up to 300, bottom, middle to top, like each time. So like the layups are there, and what's even more curious is that the widening is there. There's a widening here on the short term, there's a widening here on the midterm, and there's a widening here on the long term. All of those are technically bullish if they break out, and they're all going to break out like right here. So then the only other thing that you'd have to wonder is like this 231, because there's technically another creek there. So there's at least two that are right here, and this already broke out and up. This already technically broke out and up as well. Again, it's kind of like, it's convoluted because this chart looks bad, but like if you go step by step and you look at, there's the widening, and then it pushed up, and then it jumped over, then it iterates again. Well, it did the same thing here. There's the widening, and then it pushed up, and then it jumped over, and then you expect it to iterate again, which is what I was saying. That's like, this is like micro iteration right here going into Friday. That's really tight. So this is one of those situations where, yeah, if it drops, it's going to be really ugly just the same, because you have like this follow through, and then this follow through, and then even the bigger one follow through. But I marked it off, and I was like, well, if it does do that, it's probably going to go down to like 161, and it's probably going to take a long time to get there, and it still has a huge potential for long-term spring action way off in the future, coming back down. But if it breaks up, then the folds outward are extremely bullish, because again, this is the crazy thing, I guess, is that this first motion here, which is the completion of the first iteration, brings it into an SOS, and the SOS brings it over top the creek, the big creek right now. And that big creek over the top means that it's officially broken out of that widening, which should send it all the way to where the widening starts, which is at like 240. And that ends up lining up, if you go to 240, that ends up lining up with a jump over the next widening. So like every single breakout brings it into the next breakout. Now, does that have to happen? No, it doesn't have to happen. And obviously, if news is really bad for Apple, and it keeps being bad for Apple, then there's a delay tactic here, which is kind of my least favorite. It is very much in the middle. If the next iteration breaks down and it chops up and it stays elevated here, then what that does is it allows you to do the same thing on the bigger picture and kind of stay in the same spot. So there could be a situation where this turns into an M cross that's basically sideways. But it's about to happen. So I find it to be a very relevant stock, extremely relevant. The 300 strike, it's insane, I know. It's a huge risky play, but the 300 strike for August is like 5 cents or something. Nobody thinks it's going to go there, right? So there's a sense in like, well, I mean, you're not exactly going to lose a lot if you're wrong, right? But you have a huge amount to gain, and it's a huge push. Certainly, like, it could go south and it could go sideways. When I looked at the big picture, I was like very surprised to find that there's a large amount of consistency waveform for Apple. It doesn't have a whole lot of mystery to it. I know, again, it's a hot mess, But again, these parallels are actually being used as well. Like each of these parallels is a 50% reduction compression. And the overall structure of the wave is, again, quite simple. It may seem like I have a complicated chart, but it's not complex when you look at the bigger wave. There's been an ongoing up, down kind of motion. And we're in a spot right now where we're kind of in this limbo stage like this, where we made a higher push, but then it's had this big correction back down. It's very similar to what we see here. And this did run up like really fast in a similar time frame, to a new all-time high back in 2016. It didn't end there. It didn't stop and like just go to all-time highs and just keep. It has pretty massive backups along the way. But my point was that there's actually a really straightforward waveform. This is a high double M. This is a low double M. I mean, and it's already jumped over the creek. It's already backed up enough. It could go down lower to 161, but it doesn't need to. It's already backed up enough. It already came back to 190s, right? I mean, that's where we are now. It's literally sitting on the previous tops. So it's like it's already done enough. And so if the market chooses to mark it up, again, all being that I'm not sure, they could endure one more big drop for sure. That's kind of nasty. And it might need it. I don't know. Might need that correction still. I think it's actually really, really good. And so if I see this thing moving up, I think it's going to be extremely bullish very quickly. I do. That being said, is this a high risk play if you try to go for August? Oh yeah, like it is. Oh, they're already up a penny. I guess they're up. I don't know. Someone must have heard me talking and then decided to buy them while I was not looking. That's kind of irritating though. I don't really want to get them for 8 cents. Okay. Anyways, so I think the potential is here. I'm not positive it's going to go, but I like this structure a lot. I saw this same structure form right here on Fang. Again, and this is, again, one example. Like, I don't know for a fact it's not going to just have these big pullbacks. But I saw a very similar setup on Fang and played it recently. And the RSI and the build out for it were, again, much the same. MPW is resetting RSI really high here. That's pretty bullish. If I can hold it. I think MPW is going to be going soon. Yeah, this right here. This motion. Very similar motion. And then has this big pop. Now this has this deep retracement backwards, And I'm still feeling a bit bullish on Fang. I won't go any details on this right now, but this holds up. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't just yet. I think it could have one more, again, kind of drop here, but I think it's going to go if it can hold. So I'm looking at Apple like, well, there's a really similar build out. I can see that pop easily getting up to like near 222. So I'm feeling good about it, AMD I've been playing for a bit, but I bought in like on this bottom, so they're kind of choppy, but I think they're going to move one more time. I really think this is just the market on the whole. It needs a wave 5. So SPY is also trying. It could advance early. I think the news was kind of negative this weekend. It was something about like China and the U.S. were like cheating their trade deals. So both sides were like, you're not being, you're not holding up your end of the bargain. No, you're not. I was like, oh my gosh. It's crazy. I know it's more severe than that. it's not like kids on a playground, but I thought this might bounce out and come down again. Since it came so low the first time, I'm not sure if it's going to do it again over here. Maybe it waits till way later. Again, this is a corrective phase already, so technically it could be that it's done. I would have thought it needed one more pullback to come back down. If it doesn't, then we see it cross up and it just takes off. Then I think it comes back down later. I was saying that we don't really know. We'll just have to wait and see. Looks like it's trying, but I'm not going to hold my breath because it's the end of the day. This kind of stuff happens. Sell-offs at the end of the day. They make it look like it's going to push up and then it dumps. So I would just be like, meh. Let's wait and see what happens tomorrow on those. But yeah, I think it's the same. I think you have like a 1, 2, 3, and then 4 is usually, again, kind of corrective and sideways, and then you get 5. So I would not be surprised if this chops a little more than it has, comes down again. I'm not sure what will happen after that, but we should get another push up. I still think by the 11th, we may be back up to all-time highs, if not higher, the 11th of July. Well, who knows? We may get there early before then. This is kind of curious. Like, to be ready to sell off is what I mean by the time we get there. This could be kind of curious. I'm like looking at this. I think you could make a case that this is not going to go significantly farther. Maybe it's stuck in like a wave reaction. That's why I think we need this backup, though. It sort of has to break the mold of a possible trend, and it still has this very long outstanding kind of cat ear marker coming back. There's 2 of them, maybe. These 2. One's at like 131. The other's up here around 140s. It's a good place to kind of stop and then sell down. So I wouldn't mind. And SPY is the same way. I think you might get another push and then still sell down again. So I wonder, I don't know how you could do that. You can't have it be too far. I guess it could just not make lower lows. Or maybe it's just faster than anticipated. So I don't know if you guys remember this, but on the S&P 500, we talked about how they actually went through the motions in the same way. Like, there's some out of sequence motions, but they're almost all identical. Like, this has this push from pink back up through the yellow and then green and then back down through the yellow, and then it builds out on yellow and runs, and it's the exact same. Runs back over green. It goes from pink, hits the yellow, right? And then it goes back up to the green and then back down to the yellow. Same exact markers. It breaks out. It's essentially like a carbon copy of what's already happened. Jumps up to the top, hits green and goes, and then this is like a wave 3 of sorts in this particular context. And then it goes all the way up to the top in the same chopping mechanism we see here, we see it here. So it's essentially like a rinse repeat. It looks like a bunch of operators who didn't get out of these positions trying to go back through all these positions to probably exit them. I mean, just to be fair, or at least revisit them and check them. And then once it hit the top, once it hit this like 596 area, it backs up ultimately there's an extension here, and this is maybe the curiosity I have is like maybe there's going to be an extension there, and then it comes down later, like we saw over here, just like that, and then you get a 5. It's possible, miscalculating it, but this was already like a 1618, so I don't know. But there, it came back down to this area, and so I had marked it off, and it did. It already backed up and hit that green area, and yeah, and then the next stop was this top, so it went all the way up to 600. Eventually, it does push a little higher before it dies. Is there time to do all that going into this July 11th deadline? I think so. There's a month. The market's showing a lot of resilience based on the news, which makes me think that, again, it's kind of just trying to get done what it wants to get done. Maybe it's going to price in a bad report or something. I had thought this would be a little more like a head and shoulder, so that's why I thought, we might see it come down again. The shoulder over here was about yay long. So I didn't expect anything until maybe the 13th, which lines up very neatly with some of the other tickers in the market. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of tickers that kind of line up with that idea. This is kind of perfect as SOS. So tomorrow we'll probably find out if the market rug pulls this week, then next week's going to be really bullish. This will be a great week to buy low, in my opinion. But it would mean that this week is kind of cruddy. I'm not really looking at AMC. I don't really know what you guys... Some people are always like, just want AMC news like nonstop. I looked at it a little bit, but I spent more of my time on GME. And I frankly, like, again, there's always people that have like a lot of requests and stuff. I respect that. But we talked about with AMC was fairly straightforward. Just to recap, I think you're having a little bit of trouble right now avoiding what I would call like a, and it is right there. I mean, it turned down and broke, and there was a little weakness ahead of time. You're having what I would call like almost an impossible situation where you're not going to be able to avoid some kind of a shallow S curve. So it's building out. There was a strong 1, 2, 3 support, but it's a really low volume. This buyback in doesn't even, you would think like, oh, if it's really low volume, then when it buys up, you'd have an easy breakout. The effort required isn't the problem. It's the fact that it then got stopped and it did not advance over the high at 362. So there is a sense in which it feels like there's an imminent pull coming down because there's been a lack of follow through and there's no higher high here. So this looks like a shallow S curve. Now that could turn around really quick with the right signal, but until that happens, I'm kind of looking at 324, 320s, and that's fine. I don't think 320s are bad. There's a long-standing support back here at 320s, specifically that 322 area. You can see it. That could be it. I mean, we could hit that and just do a bounce reaction, start heading up. Maybe even seeing a green week, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it. The other possibility is like more sideways. This is what I had drawn originally, was sort of like this bounce out into a sideways week that doesn't really go anywhere. We just chill out at 350 all week. And then the final one, of course, being the drop zone. There are some clear evidences that this could go down to 292. Why am I not giving you what is, what's going to happen is because I don't know. I like the shallow S curve here because it makes a lot of sense to me from the standpoint of, like, from where I stand, the shallow S curve may make the most sense. If you want to maybe pick one, which is like a midweek drop into Wednesday, and then Friday, you're basically building back out above 350, and then going into Monday, I think you have a chance. I've got this a little bit shorter than that, but I think Monday, we'll see how this goes. You have a chance of like having a pop. I'm doubtful it happens on Friday, but it could be a Friday week, I guess. I don't know. point is I think that this bodes very well for potential for next week to have a final move on Monday or Tuesday with GME earnings. And it makes more sense to me than the full S curve. Full S curve here, it kind of rocks you down too far. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. A sign of weakness would maybe make some sense if it's a spring on a shallow S curve. So like to dip to like 321, for example, would cause this ice to break here. And that would make sense because it would be like a retest of that 321 area, but then it technically still breaks like a rising trend. And then it rockets up, and then that gives you like enough precedence to like, hey, if it rips, then when you come back down, it's going to be more violent. It's probably going to pass through it the next time. And this is where you're going to have some capitulation or whatever. That's very typical. We do that all the time. We did it right here even, where we kind of dip through it, breaks, and then passes through. So all of that makes sense to me, more so than like a complete drop here with just a reaction versus just going straight up versus even just going sideways here. I think it's a little too slow based on the way this is set up. So if I have to pick one, I'm probably going to pick the shallow S-curve at this stage. Because I think the market, and you can see it visually, I think the market is still bullish for AMC, even though we've already hit the targets that we thought we were going to hit. I do genuinely think that there may be a decent reaction still in this. But I'm not going to count my chickens before they hatch. I'm looking at 4. I'm wondering if there's some kind of a distribution that happens here. You know, it could just be a double top moment where it pops on Monday and then drops through. So there's still that. That's a question mark, meaning it does it here. But then the bigger picture was like, well, that's really far, right? Yes and no. It's kind of a return to the widening structure. It does give more ample evidence, I think, for a push on the on balance to come up that high, which is what I've been the most concerned about because the on balance was like too low. You're getting this expansion, but it hasn't yet made that push. So I had drawn it out this way, that maybe you have a backup here. I can see that curve forming. And then if it bounces out, yeah, then you should have a reaction here. It's on one side or the other. I think if it does this, there's a chance that this is going to rocket going into Monday and Tuesday. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, and it builds back out a very bullish case for, you know, a pop. So I think for GME earnings. So both of them have this very strong potential, I think, to have another big run up. And then I think it's curtains, frankly. If it goes that high, I don't think it's going to stay there. I think it'll drop down pretty fast. And we need to see the build out come back through. It's kind of similar to what happened here to some degree. But we need to see the build out come back down through it'd be like these levels. Like right there. Kind of like that. Yeah, that's actually quite right. We'll need to see it kind of build out across 3 before anything happens, but I do expect there to be a pretty nasty fallout afterwards. And we'll see. At that point, I'm just looking for a new low. I don't particularly care if it goes all the way. And the main reason for that is because someone asked me earlier about it going down to 2s. Well, yeah, I mean, as the crow flies, this could head towards 190s by earnings in August. But there's another reality here, which is like that's already in spring territory as soon as it crosses that bottom. So instead of watching just the price action, I'm going to be like a hawk watching this on balance. Because I think if it gets here and it's already down low by August, you know, it's already down in like this area, I don't necessarily think it's going to have a more significant drop. So if it's just sitting at like 240, okay, or 230, maybe it's 236 or 230 something, you know what I mean, right below. If it's already here, I'm not going to suggest that it necessarily has a massive drop still. That doesn't make any sense. And actually, if you look at what happened in 2021, it did not go to the creek. It didn't go all the way. So it doesn't match the on balance. The on balance goes all the way, but the price action doesn't, which is very possible. So anywho, maybe a little bit more red this week, but who knows? The setups are kind of looking like they want to go somewhere. They're all kind of sitting on a nice little spot, aren't they? I guess we'll find out soon enough. That doesn't really tell you anything, but maybe there's somebody's looking for good news and get some kind of news overnight. They all look like they could be a big rug pull, though, in the morning. They're all like right above. I don't know how I feel about that. They all kind of close above their creeks here, I guess. That's weird. They all did. Oh, man. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. They're all like sitting right on the edge. Well, maybe we're going to get a bullish. I guess it doesn't really matter. AMC does tend to have like an extra move in it sometimes. I wouldn't mind an extra downside move, is what I'm saying. I don't know. I think if it goes down here, I'm probably going to buy at this stage. Just the way this thing has evolved. It's not as bearish as I was expecting it to be when it hit 4. So it changed quite a bit. CDT. No, I didn't look at it. I'm going to have to go, though. I'm sorry. I didn't spend any time on extra stuff. Please ask me tomorrow, though, when I get on. I'll try to get it tomorrow. It doesn't look like this week's going to be super fast-paced necessarily, but we'll take a look. I wonder if we're going to see an on-balance break as well. This is a smaller time frame, but it does have a creek jump. Maybe that's what happens right here. It hasn't happened yet. All right, I got to go, though. Sorry, guys. Thanks for hanging out. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you later.